Why is she in the front row?" Meredith whispered it behind me, but she did not whisper it quietly. She wanted me to hear. She wanted the funeral director to hear. She wanted the women from the church to hear. She wanted the old men in uniform standing beside my husband's casket to hear. Most of all, she wanted the room to remember that in her mind, I was not family. I kept my eyes on Thomas. My husband lay beneath a flag so perfectly folded at the corners that even through grief, I noticed the work. Red, white, blue, 13 folds waiting to become a triangle, a final language only some people understand. Thomas had been dead for 3 days, and in those 3 days, his daughter had tried to erase me from every place his life had left a mark. First from the obituary, then from the funeral program, and now from the chair beside his coffin. Meredith sat 2 seats behind me in a black dress that looked expensive enough to mourn in public and uncomfortable enough to punish everyone around her. Her husband Bradley leaned forward until his mouth was close to my ear. "That row is for family," he said. "You need to move before people start asking questions." I did not turn around. I did not tell him I had been married to Thomas Hayes for 19 years. I did not tell him I had held his hand through 2 surgeries, 1 stroke scare, 12 Christmas mornings, and the slow, humiliating loss of a man's body after a lifetime of command. I did not tell him that Thomas had not called me his second wife. He had called me his last home. Instead, I looked at the old leather service folder resting beneath Thomas's metal box. It sat on the small table near the casket, half hidden under a folded program and a spray of white lilies Meredith had chosen because she said they looked cleaner than the wildflowers Thomas loved. The folder was brown leather, cracked at the spine, with a brass latch worn dull by years of hands opening and closing it. I had seen it only twice in my life. Once in a base office overseas. Once on the night Thomas told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was not to let his children touch it before the attorney arrived. Bradley's hand moved toward it, not slowly, not respectfully, the way a man reaches for something he already thinks belongs to him. His fingers closed around the brass latch, and for the first time that morning, I looked at him. "Don't," I said. "That should have been enough." At a funeral, beside a flag-draped casket, in front of 7 soldiers standing at attention, the word "don't" should have been enough. But Bradley smiled. It was a small smile, the kind men like him use when they believe age has made a woman harmless. "You don't get to decide what happens to his things," he said. Then he lifted the metal box. The corner caught the edge of the folded flag display beside it. The small triangle slipped from its stand. My body moved before my grief did. I was 72 years old. My knees hurt in cold weather, my right shoulder still locked when rain came in from the west. Some mornings I needed both hands on the sink before I trusted my balance. But training does not ask how old you are before it returns. My hand shot out. I caught the flag before it hit the floor. The chapel froze. The lilies trembled in their vase. Someone gasped behind me. The funeral director made a small sound, like a man realizing the room had just shifted in a way he did not understand. I squared the fold against my chest. I turned toward the honor guard, and in a voice I had not used since Kandahar, I said, "Detail, recover the colors." 7 rifles stopped breathing. The sergeant major at the end of the line turned his head toward me. At first, he saw what everyone else saw, an old widow in a black coat. A woman with gray hair pinned too tightly at the back of her head. A woman Meredith had introduced to everyone as Dad's wife. With the same tone people use for a rented chair or a temporary nurse. Then his eyes dropped to my hands. to the flag, to the way my thumb had found the correct edge without looking, to the old name stitched inside the collar of my coat, half visible where the black wool had opened. Carter, not Hayes, Carter. His face changed, not dramatically. Soldiers do not give strangers that much. But I saw the recognition arrive like a door opening behind his eyes. "Mom," he said, loud enough for every whisper in the chapel to die. "Why didn't anyone tell us Lieutenant Colonel Carter was in attendance?" Meredith stopped breathing. Bradley's hand loosened around the metal box. And the first salute at my husband's funeral was not for his children. It was for the woman they had tried to remove. Before I tell you what was inside that leather folder, tell me where you're watching from. I always like knowing how far stories like this travel, especially stories about people who were told to move from a seat they had already earned. And if you have ever been treated like a guest in a family you helped hold together, type front row. You will understand why I stayed quiet, because silence was not weakness that morning. Silence was evidence, and Meredith had been giving me evidence for 3 days. The first thing she erased was my name. I found out because Mrs. Donnelly from the church called me at 7:15 on Wednesday morning and said, "Evelyn, honey, I'm so sorry." I just saw the announcement. At first, I thought she meant Thomas. People say strange things when someone dies. They say announcement because death feels too heavy in the mouth. They say past because gone sounds too final. So I thanked her. I told her the service would be Saturday. I told her Thomas had gone peacefully, which was true if you only counted the last 15 minutes and not the 6 months before them. Then she got quiet. Too quiet. "Did you approve the wording?" she asked. I was standing in the kitchen wearing Thomas's old robe over my nightgown. His coffee mug was still in the sink. I had not washed it because it had the faint brown line where his lips had touched it the morning before the ambulance came. "What wording?" I asked. "The obituary." I looked toward the dining table where Meredith had left a stack of papers the night before. Funeral home forms, floral invoices. A guest list she had rewritten twice because, according to her, some of Dad's old military people don't need to be there. I opened my laptop with one hand and held the phone with the other. The obituary loaded slowly. For a moment, all I saw was Thomas's face. Not the Thomas from the hospital bed. Not the Thomas with thin wrists and bruises from IV lines. The newspaper photo was from 20 years earlier. His shoulders squared, his dress uniform immaculate, his eyes bright with the particular arrogance of a man who had survived things he never fully confessed. Colonel Thomas Hayes, decorated veteran, beloved father, grandfather, and community leader, passed peacefully surrounded by family. Read the line once. Then again, surrounded by family, the obituary named Meredith. It named her brother Paul, who lived in Arizona and had called his father twice in 4 years. It named 5 grandchildren, including one who had not visited Thomas since high school because nursing homes made her uncomfortable, even though Thomas had never been in one. It named his first wife, Patricia, who had been dead for 26 years. It named the Rotary Club, the Veterans Breakfast Association, and a Labrador named Duke, who had died in 2009. It did not name me, not once. Not as his wife, not as Evelyn, not even as survived by. Mrs. Donnelly was still on the phone. She was breathing softly, waiting for me to fall apart or explain. I did neither. I placed the laptop on the table, sat down, and looked at the sentence again. Passed peacefully surrounded by family. There are lies that shout, and there are lies that wear black and bring casseroles. That obituary was the second kind. Maybe it was an oversight, Mrs. Donnelly said. I almost smiled at that. People who love peace always want cruelty to be accidental. But Meredith did not do accidents. Meredith did arrangements. She arranged flowers. She arranged chairs. She arranged people into categories where she could control them. Blood family, real family, Dad's old life, and me. I thanked Mrs. Donnelly for calling. Then I called Meredith. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was brisk, busy, already irritated that grief had not made me more convenient. Evelyn, I'm at the printer. Is this urgent? I saw the obituary, I said. A pause. Not confusion, calculation. Oh, she said. Yes, I meant to send it to you, but everything's moving so fast. My name isn't in it. Another pause. This one's shorter. We wanted to keep it simple. Simple. 19 years of marriage became simple. 6 months of changing bandages became simple. 3 in the morning medication alarms became simple. The night Thomas woke screaming from a memory he refused to name, and I sat on the floor beside him until his hands stopped shaking, became simple. People from Dad's old life don't really know you, Meredith added. I looked at Thomas's mug in the sink. The last time he had held it, his fingers had trembled so badly I had wrapped both my hands around his just to steady the coffee. That's not true, I said. Meredith sighed. Not with grief, with inconvenience. Evelyn, please don't make this harder than it already is. Mom was part of Dad's story. You came later. You came later. As if love had a registration deadline. As if the years after 60 did not count. As if caring for a man when applause was gone meant less than standing beside him when uniforms still fit. I could have told her then. I could have told her that before I was Evelyn Hayes, I was Evelyn Carter, and there were men in Thomas's old life who knew my name better than they knew his. I could have told her that her father's service record and mine were not separate stories. They crossed in blood, dust, smoke, and a convoy road outside Kandahar where rank stopped mattering and survival became the only command anyone obeyed. But Thomas had asked me for one thing before he died. Not loudly. By then, loudness had left him. He had asked me from a hospital bed, his voice thin but his eyes clear. Let them show themselves, Evie. So I let Meredith keep talking. I'm not trying to hurt you, she said, which is what people say when they are trying to hurt you politely. I know, I said. She mistook that for surrender. That was her first mistake. The second erasure came on Thursday afternoon. The funeral program arrived in 3 neat boxes tied with white string. Meredith brought them to the house herself because she wanted me to see them before the service, but not early enough to change them. She placed one on the dining table where Thomas and I had eaten breakfast for 19 years. This is final, she said. The printer was very kind to rush it. I opened the program. On the front was Thomas in uniform, the same photo from the obituary. Inside, there was a timeline of his life. Born in Ohio, enlisted at 18, commissioned after college, married Patricia, raised 2 children, served his country with honor, retired. Became a grandfather, died surrounded by loved ones. There was a photo beneath the word married, Thomas and Patricia on their wedding day. She was beautiful. I will not lie about the dead to protect myself. Patricia had kind eyes and a bright smile, and Thomas had loved her. I knew that. I had never tried to compete with a ghost. But there was no photo of me, not our courthouse wedding, not the picture from our 10th anniversary where Thomas wore a blue sweater because I told him he looked less like a retired colonel and more like a man someone might actually ask to dance. Not the photo from the Grand Canyon where he held my hand so tightly I teased him for being afraid of heights, and he said, "No, Evie, I just know what it is to lose footing." Nothing. I turned the page. There was a section called A Life of Service. It listed Thomas's medals, his commands, his deployments, his veterans work. It did not mention the mission where he met me. It did not mention the hospital tent where I signed the evacuation order that got him out. It did not mention the letter he wrote. 3 months later, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Carter, thanking me for refusing to leave him behind. That letter was in the leather folder. I knew because Thomas had shown it to me once. Only once. He had cried when he did. Meredith stood across the table, watching my face. She wanted a reaction. Some people need grief to perform for me before they believe it is real. Meredith needed my pain to prove she still had power over the room. I folded the program closed. Exactly once. Corner to corner, old habits. Meredith's mouth tightened. "You don't like it," she said. "It's very polished." "That's not what I asked." I looked up at her. She looked like Thomas around the eyes. That was the cruel part. Grief had made me hungry for his face, and there it was, sharpened into someone who wanted me gone. "Your father wanted wildflowers," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the white lilies on the table. Dad wasn't thinking clearly near the end. He was clear enough to ask. "He was medicated. He was still Thomas." Meredith's jaw tightened. Then she said the sentence she had been carrying for years. "Mom was his real love story. You were, later." There it was again. Later, a small word used like a locked gate. I looked at the program on the table, at Patricia's young face, at Thomas's young face, at the neat little version of his life Meredith had printed in black ink, where the inconvenient woman from the last 19 years had been edited out to make the story prettier. "You're right," I said. Meredith blinked. "I came later." For the first time that afternoon, she looked satisfied. Then I finished. "I came after the parades. After the photographs. After the children were grown. After the uniforms stopped opening doors. After the nightmares had no audience. After his hands started shaking. After he needed someone who loved the man, not the myth." Her satisfaction vanished. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Act like you suffered more than us." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because suffering had become a family inheritance, and Meredith believed she owned all of it. "I'm not measuring grief," I said. "No," she snapped. "You're rewriting history." That was when Bradley walked in without knocking. He had a yellow envelope in one hand and Thomas's house keys in the other. Not his keys, Thomas's. I knew because one key still had the small strip of blue tape I had wrapped around it when his eyesight began to blur. Front door, blue tape. Back door, green tape. Garage, red tape. Bradley tossed the keys on the counter like he had just returned from inspecting a property. "We should talk logistics," he said. Meredith did not look surprised. That meant they had already talked. I looked at the envelope. "What logistics?" Bradley sat without being invited. That was something I had noticed about him years before. He entered rooms as if furniture, women, and silence were all there to support his comfort. "After the funeral, it's going to be emotionally difficult for everyone," he said. "For everyone," I repeated. He missed the warning in my voice. "Yes, Meredith and I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a little while, just while the estate gets sorted." "The estate," I said. Meredith looked toward the window. Bradley slid the envelope across the table. Temporary arrangement, nothing dramatic. I did not touch it. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers. "The house belongs with Blood family, Evelyn. You know that's what Tom would have wanted." Tom. Bradley had called him Colonel Hayes when he wanted money for a failed business idea. Sir when he wanted approval. Dad when he wanted to impress strangers. But now, with Thomas dead and paperwork on the table, he was Tom. I opened the envelope. Inside was a document titled Temporary Residence and Property Access Agreement. Temporary. Another polite word wearing a knife. The first page said I would voluntarily relocate for 90 days. The second page authorized Meredith to manage household contents. The third page gave Bradley access to storage, military memorabilia, financial records, and the safe deposit box. The fourth page had Thomas's signature at the bottom. I stared at it, then I stared at it longer. It was a good copy, good enough for a bank clerk who did not know Thomas, good enough for a rushed probate office, good enough for a grieving widow if she was tired, frightened, and alone. But not good enough for me, because Thomas Hayes did not cross his H like that. He never had, not on birthday cards, not on tax forms, not on the note he left me every February 14th, always taped to the coffee maker because he knew I woke up before him. His H had a hard downward slash, almost military in its stiffness. This one curved at the top. A scanned signature, maybe lifted from an old form, maybe pasted by someone who thought old people did not notice details. I closed the document. Bradley smiled. We don't need to make this uncomfortable. I looked at him. For a moment, I saw the entire chapel before it happened. The front row, the folded flag, the honor guard, the leather folder. Bradley reaching for something that was not his. Meredith whispering just loud enough to be heard, and me sitting still long enough for both of them to step into the truth. I placed the agreement back into the envelope. After the funeral, I said. Bradley relaxed. Meredith exhaled. They thought I meant we would discuss it after the funeral. I meant something else. After the funeral, there would be witnesses. After the funeral, Thomas's attorney would open the leather folder. After the funeral, the room would know exactly who had been family, who had been pretending, and who had tried to steal from a dead man before the dirt had even touched his coffin. Bradley stood and picked up the keys again. I let him. That was the hardest part, not because I was afraid of him. Because every instinct in me wanted to take those keys from his hand and remind him that I had survived men more dangerous than him in rooms with no witnesses and no law close enough to help. But Thomas's voice was still in my head. Let them show themselves, Evie. So I let him walk out with the keys. I let Meredith collect the funeral programs. I let the obituary remain online. I let them believe my silence meant grief had made me small. And on Saturday morning, I dressed in black, pinned my gray hair tight, took Thomas's last letter from my nightstand, and rode to the chapel in the back of a car. Meredith had not sent for me. She had forgotten widows still know how to call a taxi. She had forgotten soldiers still know how to arrive. And she had forgotten one more thing. Thomas Hayes never gave an order he did not expect to be followed. The chapel smelled like lilies, furniture polish, and rain-soaked wool. It had started raining 10 minutes before the service, the kind of slow gray rain that does not fall hard enough to be dramatic, only steady enough to make everything feel heavier. People entered quietly, shaking water from umbrellas, lowering their voices when they saw the casket at the front. Thomas would have hated the lilies. He used to say lilies made every room smell like someone had already given up. He wanted wildflowers, Queen Anne's lace, blue cornflowers, black-eyed Susans, the kind that looked like they had been gathered by hand from a roadside field and carried home in an old coffee can. But Meredith had ordered white lilies because they photographed better. That was how she had handled all of it. Not as a goodbye, as a presentation. The chapel had 2 center aisles, 12 rows on each side, and a small raised platform where the pastor stood beside Thomas's flag-draped casket. 7 members of the honor guard stood along the right wall in dress uniform, still as fence posts, rifles angled with ceremonial precision. The front row had 6 seats. Meredith had placed a printed card on the first one, reserved for Hayes' family. I looked at that card for a long time when I arrived, not because it surprised me. Because the handwriting was not Thomas's. Thomas never wrote in loops. He wrote in straight lines and hard corners, as if even grocery lists were orders. This card had Meredith's soft, expensive handwriting. Pretty. False. I sat down anyway. The first seat, closest to Thomas, closest to the flag, closest to the leather folder on the small table beside his metal box. No one stopped me at first. That was the thing about cruelty in public. It often needs a minute to collect an audience. The funeral director, Mr. Callahan, saw me sit and looked down at his clipboard. He was a thin man with silver glasses and the delicate panic of someone who had already been yelled at by Meredith that morning. He took 1 step toward me, then stopped when he saw the older woman beside the casket. Attorney Miriam Shaw. Miriam had been Thomas's lawyer for 15 years. She wore a dark navy suit instead of black, and she carried a leather satchel that looked almost as old as mine. Her hair was white, cut short, and her expression had the calm sharpness of a woman who had spent her life watching families become honest only when money was involved. She saw me. She did not smile. She only gave me 1 slow nod. That nod told me everything. The folder had arrived. Thomas's instructions had arrived, and the trap Meredith and Bradley had built was already standing inside a room with witnesses. I folded my hands in my lap. For 20 minutes, people came to the front to look at Thomas. Some touched the casket, some saluted. Some simply stood there with the helpless posture of people who have outlived too many friends. A retired nurse from the VA came over and squeezed my shoulder. "He adored you," she whispered. I said, "I know." A man with a cane and a navy pin leaned down and said, "Colonel always said you were the reason he made it home from the desert." I looked toward Meredith. She was watching. I said only, "He gave me too much credit." The man shook his head. "No, Mom. Men like him don't give away credit unless it's earned." Meredith's face tightened. She crossed the aisle before he had even reached the door. "Evelyn," she said, smiling at the room, but not at me. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" No. The word was quiet. It was not rude. It was final. Her smile twitched. "People are arriving. We need the seating to make sense." "It makes sense. Not to everyone." I looked at Thomas's casket, then everyone can learn. Her eyes flashed. For half a second, I saw the girl she must have been after her mother died. Angry, scared, certain that any woman who came after Patricia must be stealing something. I could have had mercy on that girl. I had for 19 years. I had never asked her to call me Mom. I had never touched Patricia's photographs. I had never sat in Patricia's chair at Christmas until Thomas himself moved it and told me. Ghosts don't need furniture, Evie. Living people do. But Meredith was no longer a grieving girl. She was a grown woman in a black dress, using her father's funeral to remove his widow from the room. Behind her, Bradley hovered near the guest book. He was smiling and shaking hands as if he owned the grief. Dad's friends from the veterans group are confused, Meredith said. About what? About who you are. That was when I looked at her fully. She had put on pearls, Patricia's pearls. Thomas had kept them in a velvet box in the top drawer for decades. When Meredith asked for them 2 years earlier, he had said no. Not because he did not love her, because Patricia's will had left them to a granddaughter when she turned 30. Meredith wore them anyway. "Then you should explain," I said. Her fingers touched the pearls. "Don't make this embarrassing." "Meredith," I said, "your father is in a casket 12 feet from us. Choose your next sentence with care." She leaned closer. The perfume she wore was too sweet. "Fine," she whispered. "You were his wife on paper. But this row is for his children, his grandchildren, and the people who actually knew him when he was someone. When he was someone. Not when he was alive. Not when he was loved. When he was someone." That was the moment I understood Meredith had never mourned Thomas the man. She mourned Thomas the symbol, the colonel, the father. The photograph in uniform, the name on plaques, the man people praised because praising him made the Hayes family important. She had no use for the Thomas who needed help buttoning his shirt, no use for the Thomas who cried in the pantry because he could no longer remember the call sign of a man who died beside him. No use for the Thomas who asked me to cut his pills in half and then apologized because he hated needing anything. That Thomas was mine, and she resented me for knowing him. "I knew him," I said. "No," she said, "you knew what was left." Her words landed clean, sharp. The kind of sentence that does not need shouting because it has already found the soft place. I heard someone behind us inhale. Good. Let them hear. Let the room have witnesses. I leaned back in the chair. "I'm staying here." Her face hardened. Then she looked over my shoulder and gave a small nod. Bradley started walking toward us. He had been waiting for that nod. Of course he had. A man like Bradley did not create pressure by himself. He waited until a woman like Meredith gave him permission to pretend pressure was protection. "Evelyn," he said, too loudly, "let's not make a scene." The phrase moved through the first rows like a dropped glass. "Let's not make a scene." That was how people like him made you responsible for the scene they created. He placed one hand on the back of my chair and the other on the program in my lap. Not touching me yet. Testing. "Mr. Callahan has a seating chart," Bradley said. "We're just asking you to respect Tom's family." I looked past him at the funeral director. Mr. Callahan looked like he wanted the floor to open. Miriam Shaw stood near the metal table, still as a judge. The honor guard did not move, but I saw one of them, the sergeant major at the end, shift his eyes. Not his head, only his eyes. He was listening. Good. "Thomas was my husband," I said. Bradley's smile became pitying. "In the legal sense, sure." That one made an old woman in the second row whisper, "Lord have mercy." Bradley heard it and flushed, not with shame, with irritation. He lowered his voice, but not enough. "Look, we're all trying to honor a decorated man today. This isn't about you." I almost thanked him. He had just handed me the whole case in one sentence. "This isn't about you." At my husband's funeral, in the chair Thomas had instructed me to sit in, beside the flag I would receive, near the folder he had left with my name in it. I looked down at my hands. They were folded loosely now, not clenched. A clenched hand tells people you are fighting. A loose hand lets them forget you can. Bradley bent closer. "You need to move to the third row." "No." Meredith gave a brittle laugh. "Evelyn, please, you're making this ugly." "No," I said. "You are." Her face went pale with anger. Bradley's hand finally touched my elbow. Not hard. That would come later if I allowed it. For now, it was the kind of touch people use when they want a room to see them as reasonable while forcing someone else to obey. I looked at his fingers on my coat. Then, I looked at him. He removed them. Slowly. Smart enough to understand something in my eyes. Not smart enough to stop. "Mr. Callahan?" Meredith called. The funeral director approached with his clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. "Yes, Mrs. Whitcomb." "Mrs. Whitcomb." Not Mrs. Hayes. That was Meredith's married name, but she enjoyed how official it sounded in that room. "There seems to be some confusion with the seating," she said. Mr. Callahan swallowed. "I have the reserved family row here. Yes, and she is refusing to move." The word refusing was chosen carefully. Not grieving, not sitting, refusing. People turned. Programs paused mid-fold. The honor guard remained at attention, but the room had shifted around them. Even ceremonial stillness has a temperature, and the chapel had gone cold. Mr. Callahan looked at me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly. Meredith's jaw tightened at the name. "Would you be comfortable moving one row back until we can?" "No," I said. His eyes flicked to Meredith, then to Miriam. Miriam finally stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Before you make any seating changes, I suggest you confirm which set of instructions you are following." Meredith's head snapped toward her. "What does that mean?" Miriam did not answer Meredith. She looked at the funeral director. "You received an envelope from my office this morning." Mr. Callahan blinked. "Yes, but Mrs. Whitcomb said the family had already finalized. The envelope was from Colonel Hayes. That landed, not loudly, but it landed." Meredith gave a small laugh. "My father has been dead since Tuesday." Miriam looked at her. "Yes, which is why written instructions matter." Bradley stepped in. "We're not doing legal theater at a funeral." "No," Miriam said. "We are doing exactly what your father-in-law requested at his funeral." My heart tightened at that. Not because I was surprised, because Thomas had been so tired when he planned this, so thin, so angry that death was turning him into an event other people would organize. He had known. He had known Meredith would try to rewrite the room. He had known Bradley would reach for what was not his. He had known I would rather disappear than fight his children beside his casket. So he had written an order for me. One final order: stay. The pastor cleared his throat near the pulpit. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Meredith noticed the room slipping away from her and did what people like Meredith always do when control starts to crack. She became wounded. "I cannot believe this," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound like pain. "My father is lying there, and you people are turning his funeral into paperwork." "You brought the seating chart," I said. Her eyes cut to me. For a moment, the trembling disappeared. "You don't get to lecture me about my father." "No," I said, "but I do get to bury my husband." The room went still again. Meredith's mouth opened, then closed. Bradley saved her because Bradley always thought volume could replace truth. "Tom would be ashamed of this," he said. I looked at him. "No," I said. "Thomas would have corrected your posture." Someone in the back coughed into a hand. It might have been a laugh. Bradley's face darkened. He took one step closer to the metal table. That was when I knew he was going to make the mistake. Not yet, but soon. He looked at the metal box the way he had looked at the house keys, as property, as leverage, as something he could remove from my reach and call it order. The box was made of dark walnut, polished but old. Inside, beneath glass, were Thomas's medals arranged with the precision he respected in public and avoided in drawers. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons lined in rows. I sat at the leather folder. The brass latch caught chapel light. Bradley saw me looking at it. His smile returned. "What is that?" he asked. Miriam answered before I could. "Private." "For family?" Bradley asked. "For the appropriate person," Miriam said. Meredith's face sharpened. "If that folder concerns my father, I have a right to see it." Miriam adjusted her glasses. You may have a right to hear parts of it. You do not have a right to open it. That was too much for Meredith. Not the words, the refusal. She was used to people stepping aside when she said, "My father." Used to her grief becoming a passkey. Used to Patricia's memory being a weapon no one challenged because challenging the dead feels unkind. She turned on me. Did you put her up to this? No, don't lie. I didn't. Then why is she here with some secret folder? I looked at Thomas. Because he knew you, I thought. Because he loved you and still knew you. Because love and trust are not the same thing. Aloud, I said nothing. If you have ever watched someone mistake your silence for weakness, type silent in the comments. Not because silence means surrender, but because sometimes silence is the only way to let a cruel person finish building the case against themselves. I was not sitting in that front row because I needed their permission. I was sitting there because my husband had asked me to stay long enough for the truth to stand up by itself. The pastor tried again. Perhaps we should begin, he said. Meredith turned on him with the same smile she had used on the funeral director. Yes, Pastor, please. My father deserves dignity. Dignity. Another pretty word in her mouth. The service began. The pastor spoke about duty, about sacrifice, about Thomas's service to his country, his community, and his family. He read from the program Meredith had approved. Colonel Hayes was a devoted father, a loving grandfather, a faithful husband to his beloved Patricia. There it was, even from the pulpit. Patricia. Not Evelyn. No one had told the pastor the program was incomplete. Or maybe someone had, and Meredith had corrected them before they could correct it. I sat still. I had learned stillness in places where movement drew fire. The pastor continued. Thomas Hayes believed in honor. He believed a man's legacy is not measured by what he owns, but by who stands for him after he is gone. Miriam looked at me then, just briefly. Who stands for him? Meredith sniffed behind me. Bradley shifted his feet. The honor guard remained silent. Then the pastor invited Meredith to speak. She rose with a folded page in both hands. Her pearls glowed against her black dress. She walked to the pulpit slowly, every step measured for sympathy. When she reached the microphone, she looked at Thomas's casket and began to cry before she began to speak, not loudly. Just enough. My father, she said, was a man of service. Most people here knew him as Colonel Hayes, but to us, he was Dad. Good opening, clean, human. For a moment, I wanted her to stay there, in the truth. But Meredith did not trust truth unless she could decorate it. He taught us loyalty, she continued. He taught us blood matters. He taught us that family is not something temporary. It is not something that appears at the end and claims a place it did not build. The chapel shifted. There it was. She did not look at me. She did not have to. Every person in the room understood where the blade was pointed. My hands stayed loose. He loved our mother, Patricia, with a devotion that shaped all of us. Their marriage was the foundation of his life. A woman in the third row glanced at me, then away. That hurt more than Meredith. Cowardice often does. Meredith folded the page. Then she stopped reading. That was when the real speech began. In his final years, Dad was not always surrounded by the people who understood him best, she said. Illness can make a proud man dependent. It can make him vulnerable, influenced. Bradley bowed his head as if the word had weight. Influenced. The same word people use in court when they do not want to say manipulated. The room became very quiet. Miriam's expression hardened. Mr. Callahan stared at his clipboard. The sergeant major's eyes moved again. Meredith placed one hand over her heart. So today, I ask that we honor the whole of my father's life. Not just the last chapter, not just the people who happened to be beside him at the end, but the family who carried his name from the beginning. That was when I felt the first real anger of the morning. Not grief, not pain, anger, cold, clean, clarifying, because Meredith could insult me. She could erase me from paper. She could wear pearls that were not hers and order flowers Thomas hated, but she had just turned his illness into an accusation. She had made his final months sound like weakness. She had made his love sound like confusion. And I knew then that Thomas had been right. Let them show themselves. Meredith had. She stepped down from the pulpit to soft applause. Not everyone clapped. Enough did. That was how rooms become guilty. Not all at once. A few hands at a time. When she returned to her seat, she leaned forward and whispered into my ear, "Now move." There it was. The command beneath the eulogy. I did not move. Bradley stood. The pastor looked alarmed. Meredith whispered again, sharper. "You are embarrassing yourself." I turned my head slightly. "No," I said. "I am listening." "To what?" "To Thomas." Her face twisted. "You don't get to use his name like that." Bradley stepped into the aisle. "Okay," he said loudly. "That's enough." The chapel watched him. He looked bigger when he had an audience. Men like him often do. Private cowards grow muscles in public when they believe the crowd will call restraint maturity. He reached toward me again. This time, he intended to lift me by the arm. Miriam moved. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, "do not touch my client. My client!" The word struck harder than a slap. Meredith stared at her. "Your client? Yes." Bradley laughed once. "She's not part of the estate." Miriam opened her satchel. "No, she is the primary protected party in it." Bradley's smile faltered. "Only for a second. But I saw it." Meredith saw it too, and fear made her crueler. "This is insane," she said. "That woman barely knew half of Dad's life." The sergeant major finally turned his head. Not fully, just enough that the brass on his cap caught the light. Meredith did not notice. Bradley did. He looked toward the honor guard, then back at the medal table. He needed control back. His eyes went to the walnut box. "I'm taking Dad's medals," he said. "No, you're not," Miriam said. "He is not your father," Meredith snapped at her. "No," Miriam replied. "He was my client." Bradley took another step toward the table. "Those belong to the Hayes family. They belong where Colonel Hayes instructed them to remain." "With us," Meredith said. Miriam shook her head. "With his wife." The word wife moved through the chapel like a match touching dry paper. Meredith's composure cracked. She was not his real wife. There it was, clear, public, unavoidable. I heard Mrs. Donnelly whisper, "Oh, Meredith." Bradley should have stopped then. A smarter man would have. A kinder woman would have. But Meredith was breathing hard now, and Bradley had the hungry look of a man watching inheritance leak out of a room. He reached the medal table. "Bradley," I said. One word, his name. Not a plea, a warning. He turned his head and smiled. "You've had enough attention today." Then he placed both hands on Thomas's medal box. The chapel seemed to hold its breath. Miriam said, "Do not move that." Bradley lifted it anyway. The walnut base scraped against the table. The leather folder shifted beneath it. The brass latch clicked against wood. And the small folded ceremonial flag beside the box slid sideways, tipped once, and fell. For everyone else, it was an accident, a piece of cloth slipping, a small disruption in an already uncomfortable room. For me, it was not cloth. It was color. It was country. It was a promise folded into geometry. It was the last thing Thomas would be given by men who understood the language of duty better than any of his children had that morning. My body moved. The chair struck the back of my legs as I rose. My right hand caught the flag before it touched the floor. My left hand came up beneath it, supporting the fold. I turned my shoulders to shield it from Bradley's reach. The chapel disappeared, not fully, but enough. For 1 second, I was not 72. I was not a widow. I was not a woman being asked to move from a front row. I was back in a field hospital where the floor shook from rotor wash, and a young private screamed for his mother while my hands held pressure on a wound that did not care about rank. I was on a convoy road where smoke turned noon into dusk, and Thomas Hayes, then still arrogant enough to argue with death, looked at me through blood and dust and said, "Leave me." I did not leave him then. I would not let them dishonor him now. I squared the flag against my chest. I checked the fold, cleaned the edge with my thumb, lifted my chin. Then I turned toward the honor guard. My voice came out before sorrow could soften it. Detail: 7 bodies sharpened, recover the colors. The command cracked through the chapel. Not loud, correct. There is a difference. A loud voice asks to be obeyed. A correct one already knows it will be. The honor guard froze. The sergeant major at the end of the line turned toward me. Bradley stood with Thomas's metal box half lifted in both hands. Meredith's mouth was open. The pastor had one hand on the pulpit. Mr. Callahan looked like he had stopped breathing. The sergeant major's eyes went first to the flag in my hands, then to my posture, then to the name stitched inside my coat, visible where the collar had shifted when I stood. Carter, his expression changed, not into shock, into recognition. Careful, disciplined, immediate. He stepped forward once. His boots struck the chapel floor with a sound so clean that even Bradley lowered the metal box. "Mom," the sergeant major said. The word landed differently from every mom I had been given that week. It was not age, it was rank. He looked past me to Miriam. "Counselor," he said, "is that the service folder Colonel Hayes referenced in his funeral instruction?" Miriam opened the leather folder. Meredith whispered, "What funeral instruction?" No one answered her. Miriam removed a single page. The paper was cream-colored, heavy, signed at the bottom in Thomas's unmistakable hand. Hard slash through the H. No curve, no forgery, Miriam read aloud. "If there is any dispute regarding seating, honors, military property, or final family recognition, my attorney is instructed to open this folder in the presence of the honor detail." Meredith's face lost color. Miriam continued, "My wife, Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Carter Hayes, will sit in the first seat of the first row." Bradley's fingers slipped off the metal box. The walnut base hit the table with a dull, final sound. Miriam's voice did not shake. "If anyone challenges her place, my service record and hers are to be read before a single word of committal is spoken." I kept the flag against my chest. The room had gone so silent, I could hear rain tapping the chapel windows. The sergeant major turned fully toward me then. He brought his heels together. And before the full salute came, before the record was read, before Meredith understood exactly what she had done, he asked the question that ended every lie in that chapel. "Mom," he said, "why weren't we informed Lieutenant Colonel Carter was present?" I looked at Meredith, then at Bradley, then at Thomas's casket, and I answered quietly, "Because they thought I was only his widow. Because they thought I was only his widow." The words did not echo. The chapel was too full for echo. They simply landed on Meredith, on Bradley, on the pastor holding his place in the program with one trembling finger, on every person who had clapped politely when Meredith suggested my husband had been too weak, too sick, too influenced to know who he loved at the end of his life. The sergeant major did not look at Meredith. He looked at me, not with pity, That would have insulted me. He looked at me the way soldiers look at a superior officer they should have recognized sooner. Then he turned to Miriam Shaw. "Counselor," he said, "read the record." Meredith stepped forward. No, it was the first honest word she had spoken all morning. Not polished, not controlled, just fear. Miriam did not even glance at her. She unfolded the next page from Thomas's leather folder. The paper shook once in her hand, not from nerves, but from age. The folder had been opened and closed by Thomas so many times that some of the documents were soft at the creases. Miriam adjusted her glasses. Then she read, "Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Marie Carter Hayes, United States Army. Combat Medical Command, 29 years of service." The room went still in a different way. Before, it had been still with discomfort. Now it was still with correction. A woman in the second row whispered, "Lieutenant Colonel?" Bradley's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. Miriam continued, "Silver Star, Legion of Merit. Bronze Star with Valor, Meritorious Service Medal, Humanitarian Service Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Iraq Campaign Medal, NATO Medal." Each word hit like a boot step, not because medals make a person worthy. Medals are metal, ribbons are cloth. But in that chapel, after 3 days of being called temporary, after 3 days of being treated like an old woman who had wandered into the wrong family, those pieces of record did what my grief had refused to do. They spoke, stared at me as if my face had changed. It had not. That was what frightened her. I had been this woman when she erased me from the obituary. I had been this woman when she replaced our wedding photo with Patricia's. I had been this woman when Bradley slid forged paperwork across my dining table. Her mistake had not been underestimating what I had done. Her mistake had been thinking I needed her to see it for it to be real. Miriam turned another page. "This letter is handwritten by Colonel Thomas Hayes," she said, "dated 6 weeks before his death." My throat tightened then, not at the rank, not at the medals, at the date. 6 weeks before his death, Thomas could barely hold a pen for more than a minute. His fingers cramped. His right hand shook so badly, he joked that his signature looked like a lie detector test. But he had written anyway. Miriam began, "To whoever tries to decide where my wife belongs after I am gone." A sound went through the chapel. Small, human. Because that sentence was Thomas. Dry, direct. Tired of everyone's nonsense before anyone had started. Miriam read on, "If you are hearing this, then someone has challenged Evelyn's seat, her name, her place, or her right to receive the honors I asked to be given in my presence. That means I knew my family better than they hoped I did." Meredith flinched. Her pearls shifted against her throat. "Dad would never." Miriam raised one hand without looking up, and Meredith stopped. That was the power of paper. Cruel people understand it only when paper stops obeying them. Miriam continued, "I met Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Carter on the worst day of my life. I was bleeding, half-blind, angry, and stupid enough to order her to leave me behind. She refused. She overrode 2 men, 1 order, and common sense. She got me onto the last evacuation bird before the road disappeared under fire. The chapel disappeared for me. For a moment, I smelled dust, hot metal, burnt rubber, blood that had dried too fast in the heat. Thomas's hand slippery in mine. His voice, younger then, arrogant even with shrapnel in his side. 'Leave me, Lieutenant Colonel.' And my answer, 'Shut up, Colonel. You're not dying on my paperwork.' In the chapel, someone let out a broken laugh. Maybe they did not mean to. Maybe they were crying. Miriam kept reading. She saved my life before she ever loved me. Later, when age took the uniform from me, she saved it again. Not the life people applauded. the life no one saw, the one with pills, fear, memory loss, anger, and shame. My children knew the man in photographs. Evelyn knew the man after the photographs stopped helping. Meredith pressed her fingers to her mouth. This time, there were tears in her eyes. I did not know whether they were grief or humiliation. Sometimes people cannot tell the difference when pride is dying. Miriam's voice softened, but she did not stop. If my daughter has forgotten kindness in her grief, I forgive the grief. I do not excuse the cruelty. If my son-in-law has reached for property before my body is buried, I ask my attorney to treat that not as grief, but as evidence. Bradley went gray, not pale, gray. The blood seemed to drain from his face and leave something waxy behind. His eyes moved toward the chapel doors, then toward the metal box, then toward the leather folder, looking for an exit, a witness, a loophole. He found only people watching him. Miriam folded the letter halfway, then read the final paragraph. My wife will sit in the front row. My wife will receive my flag. My wife will decide where my medals go. And if the honor detail is present, they are to know that the highest-ranking soldier in that room is not in the casket. She is the woman my family may be foolish enough to ask to move. No one breathed, not even Meredith. The sergeant major stepped back. His jaw tightened. His eyes shone, but he did not let the tears fall. He turned to the honor guard. Detail. 7 soldiers moved as one, boots aligned, shoulders squared. Rifles came into position. The chapel seemed smaller suddenly, as if the room itself understood it was no longer hosting a family argument. It was witnessing a correction. The sergeant major faced me. Present arms, the rifles lifted, clean, synchronized, final. The first full salute of my husband's funeral was not aimed at the casket. It was aimed at me. I held the folded flag against my chest with both hands, not because I deserved worship. I did not. Not because Meredith had been defeated. She had defeated herself. I held it because Thomas had known I would need both hands to receive the one thing his family could not rewrite: truth. The salute lasted only seconds, but grief stretches time. In those seconds, I saw Thomas at 38, bleeding through a field bandage and cursing me for saving him. I saw him at 59, standing outside the courthouse after we married, pretending not to cry because the judge had called me Mrs. Hayes. I saw him at 75, unable to lift his spoon, whispering, "I hate this, Evie." I saw him 6 weeks before death, forcing his hand across paper because he knew love without documentation would not survive Meredith's version of mourning. The rifles lowered, the room exhaled, and then Meredith broke. "This is not fair," she said. It was such a childish sentence that for a moment I felt sorry for her. Not enough to save her, but enough to see the wound beneath the performance. She had wanted one clean story. Father, mother, children, a perfect first family frozen in time. I had ruined the photograph by being alive. "No," I said quietly, "it wasn't." She looked at me, startled. I stood with the flag still in my hands. "It wasn't fair when your mother died. It wasn't fair that your father kept living and needed love again. It wasn't fair that sickness made him small in front of people who remembered him tall." Her face trembled. I took one step toward her, but you turned unfairness into permission. She swallowed. "You don't understand what it was like. I understand more than you think." "No, you don't," she snapped. "You got him at the end. You got the house, the papers, the nurse roll, the sympathy. You got to be there when he died." "Yes," I said. "I got to be there when he died." That stopped her. Because death sounds romantic only to people who did not hold the body afterward. "I got the nights he forgot where he was," I said. "I got the sheets. I got the pills. I got the fear he tried to hide from you so you could keep your hero. I got the man who apologized because he could not button his own shirt. I got the end, Meredith, and I stayed." Her face crumpled. Bradley stepped in because he could not bear a room that was not about him. "This is emotional manipulation," he said. Miriam closed the folder. "No, Mr. Whitcomb. What you attempted was emotional manipulation. This is record," he pointed at her. "You can't accuse me of anything." "I have not accused you," Miriam said. "Yet." The word "yet" made him step back. The pastor looked like he wanted to vanish behind the pulpit. Mr. Callahan whispered to an assistant, and the assistant quietly closed the chapel doors. Not to trap anyone. To stop the scene from spilling into the lobby, Miriam removed another document. "This portion does not need to be read during the service," she said. But since Mr. Whitcomb attempted to remove military property from the memorial table, and since Mrs. Whitcomb publicly challenged Mrs. Hayes's legal status, Colonel Hayes authorized me to summarize the estate instructions in the presence of witnesses. Bradley's eyes widened. "Here," Miriam looked around the chapel. "Here is where you chose to make the dispute public." No one moved. Even the rain seemed quieter. Miriam read with the calm of a woman who billed in 6-minute increments and enjoyed being precise. The house at 418 Marlowe Road remained solely with Evelyn Carter Hayes until her death or voluntary sale. No child, stepchild, spouse of child, or extended relative is authorized to enter, inventory, remove, sell, transfer, or claim household property without her written consent. Bradley's lips parted. Meredith looked at him. That was when I knew he had promised her something. Maybe he had told her the house would be easy. Maybe he had told her I had no fight left. Maybe he had told her old widows signed whatever sounded official if you pressed hard enough before the funeral. Miriam continued. Colonel Hayes's medals, uniforms, service letters, and battlefield correspondence are entrusted to Evelyn Carter Hayes. Upon her death, they are to be donated to the Military Medical History Archive named in this document. Bradley's face twitched. There went the medals. Not just sentiment, value, control. Meredith found her voice. Dad would have wanted us to have something. Miriam looked at her for the first time with something close to sadness. He did. Meredith's shoulders dropped, almost in relief. Personal letters from your childhood, your mother's recipe box, the family Bible, several photographs, and a financial gift from a separate account conditional upon no contest to the will. Meredith stared. That's it? The words escaped before she could dress them in grief. That's it? Not thank you. Not he kept my childhood letters. Not Mom's recipe box. That's it? The room heard it, and Meredith heard herself. Her face burned. Miriam slid the document back into the folder. There is also a note regarding the temporary residence and property access agreement presented to Mrs. Hayes on Thursday. Bradley went still, completely still, the kind of stillness prey animals understand. Meredith turned toward him. What agreement? Ah, so he had not told her everything. Miriam's voice remained even. Colonel Hayes anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to pressure his wife into leaving the home before probate. He instructed me to review any document presented to her within 30 days of his death. Bradley swallowed. I watched his throat move. Once, twice. Miriam, I said. She looked at me. I held out the yellow envelope I had brought in my black handbag. The one Bradley thought I had accepted. The one with Thomas's false signature at the bottom. Bradley whispered, Evelyn. There was the first time he used my name correctly. Not Mrs. Hayes, not sweetheart, not she, Evelyn. Fear is sometimes the first honest etiquette cruel people learn. I gave the envelope to Miriam. She removed the pages, examined the signature, and then looked at Bradley. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, "this signature is not Colonel Hayes's." He laughed. "Badly. Too late." "That's ridiculous." Miriam turned the page toward the room. "The H is wrong." I almost smiled. Thomas would have loved that. Not the cruelty, not the scene, but the fact that after all the titles, medals, lawyers, and military protocol, one arrogant man was undone by a letter H. Miriam continued, "This document also attempts to grant you access to a safe deposit box you are not named on, household property you do not own, and military memorabilia specifically protected in Colonel Hayes's estate plan." Bradley looked at Meredith. Meredith looked back at him as if she had never seen him before. "You said she agreed," Meredith whispered. "She did," Bradley snapped. "No," I said. "I said after the funeral." He turned on me. "You knew." I looked at Thomas's casket. Yes, the answer seemed to make him smaller. Miriam placed the document back in the envelope. "I will be forwarding this to the probate attorney and, if necessary, to the appropriate authorities. I would advise you not to contact Mrs. Hayes except through counsel." Bradley's face changed again. Not anger now, calculation. He looked around and saw no allies. The old women from church watched him with open disgust. The veterans watched him with something colder. Meredith stood very still, her pearls no longer elegant, only stolen-looking. Then she turned to me. "We can fix this," she said. There it was. Not apology. Repair. People like Meredith always wanted to fix the consequence, never the wound. I said nothing. She stepped closer. "Evelyn, please. We're family." I looked at the front row, at the reserved card, at the program without my photograph, at the flowers Thomas never wanted, at the metal box Bradley had tried to take. Then I looked at her. Family does not need a funeral director to remind them where a widow sits. Her mouth trembled. "I was grieving." "Yes," I said, "so was I." She had no answer for that. Because grief explains tears, it does not explain theft, it does not explain forgery. It does not explain standing at a pulpit and accusing a dying man's wife of influence because the truth threatened your inheritance. The pastor finally stepped forward. His voice was unsteady but gentle. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and this time everyone knew which Mrs. Hayes he meant. "Would you like us to continue?" I looked at Thomas. The room waited for me. That was another thing Meredith had not expected. Not that I would win, that I would be given the choice. I returned to the front seat, my seat. The first seat of the first row. I placed the folded flag carefully across my lap. "Continue," I said. The rest of the service was shorter, or maybe it only felt shorter because the lies had been removed. The pastor did not read from Meredith's program again. He spoke instead about a man who had served, suffered, loved twice, failed sometimes, and planned carefully enough to protect the woman he left behind. At the cemetery, the rain stopped. The clouds stayed low and gray, but the rain stopped, just as the honor guard lifted the casket. I followed behind Thomas, not Meredith, not Bradley, me. No one challenged the order this time. The grass was wet beneath my shoes. The air smelled of soil and cold stone. Somewhere beyond the cemetery wall, traffic moved like ordinary life had not noticed one world ending. At the graveside, the rifles fired. 3 volleys. Each one cracked the morning open. Meredith flinched at the first. Bradley flinched at all 3. I did not. Not because I was stronger. Because some sounds have lived in your body so long they become rooms you know how to enter. The boogler played taps. That nearly broke me. Not the rifles, not the record, not Meredith. Taps. Thomas used to hum it badly when he polished his old shoes, just to annoy me. He had no musical talent and no shame about it. The memory came so suddenly that my knees weakened. The sergeant major saw. He did not step forward. He did not embarrass me with help I had not asked for. He simply shifted half a step closer. Close enough that if I fell, I would not hit the ground. That is respect. Not saving someone before they need it. Standing near enough that they can choose. When the flag was folded, he carried it to me. Every movement exact, every fold sharp. He knelt, his voice lowered. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation. I heard the words. I had heard them before too many times. But this was Thomas, my Thomas. The man who left socks in the kitchen because he claimed the dryer was a communist device. The man who pretended not to like my lemon cake and ate half of it every Sunday. The man who told his children only the parts of himself they could admire and gave me the parts he was afraid they would not love. The sergeant major placed the flag in my hands. This time I let myself cry, quietly, not for the room, for him. Meredith stood behind me. I felt her there. I felt her wanting to come closer and not knowing whether she still had the right. After the prayer, people began to leave in small clusters. No one knew what to say to me. That was fine. Silence had been honest with me all day. Mrs. Donnelly kissed my cheek. The Navy man with the cane saluted Thomas's grave, then saluted me. Miriam touched my shoulder once and said, "I'll come by tomorrow." I nodded. Bradley did not approach me. He stood near the path, speaking urgently into his phone until Meredith took the phone from his hand and walked away from him. That part, I admit, I watched, not with pleasure, with recognition. Every lie eventually demands payment. Sometimes the bill arrives in court, sometimes at a grave. Meredith came to me last. Her makeup had run beneath one eye. The pearls were gone from her neck. She held them in her hand, wrapped around her fingers like a rosary she did not know how to pray. "I shouldn't have worn these," she said. "No," I said. She looked down. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" Lowe's him. For the first time all week, she sounded like a daughter. Not an organizer, not an heir, not a gatekeeper, a daughter. I could have softened then. Part of me wanted to. Thomas had loved her, even when she made loving her hard. He had kept every school picture, every ugly Father's Day mug, every letter she wrote from summer camp. He had not cut her from his heart, only from power over me. "I know," I said. She looked up quickly, hungry for forgiveness. I did not give it, not because I hated her, because forgiveness offered too early becomes permission. "You can grieve him," I said. "You can miss him. You can be angry that he loved me. You can be angry that your mother died and I lived, but you will not erase me again." She cried harder. "I'm sorry." I believed she meant it in that moment. I also knew one moment cannot repay 19 years. "Then remember what you saw," I said. She nodded. I turned away before she could ask for more. That was my boundary, not cruelty. Boundary, I rode home in Miriam's car. Not because I could not call a taxi again, because this time someone offered without trying to own the ride. The house was quiet when I entered. Bradley had left Thomas's keys on the kitchen counter before the graveside service. Funny how quickly men return things when documents begin speaking. I picked them up. Blue tape for the front door, green for the back, red for the garage. Thomas's system, our system. I washed his coffee mug, not because I was ready, because dried coffee is still dried coffee, and grief does not make a kitchen clean itself. Then I went to the living room and removed Meredith's funeral program from my handbag. I looked once at the photo of Thomas and Patricia. I did not hate it. She had loved him first. That was true. But first is not the same as only. I placed the program in a drawer. Not the trash, the drawer. Then I took out the obituary Thomas had written himself. Miriam had given it to me in a sealed envelope after the cemetery. It was short. Too short, honestly. Thomas had never wasted words when 6 would do. Colonel Thomas Hayes is survived by his wife, Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Carter Hayes, who saved his life twice, once in war and once at home. I read it 3 times. Then I placed it beside our wedding photo, the courthouse one. The one Meredith had removed from the story because I had come later. In the photo, Thomas was looking at me instead of the camera. I used to tease him for ruining the picture. Now I was grateful. Proof does not always need a notary. Sometimes it only needs a man forgetting to perform, because love has made him look sideways. I set the folded flag beneath the photo, the leather service folder beside it. The house was still, but it was not empty. The front row at a funeral is not just a chair, it is a declaration. It says who carried the love when the room got hard. It says who stayed when the applause ended. It says who knew the man after the uniform, after the title, after the myth had loosened its grip. They ask why I was in the front row. That was the wrong question. Thomas had not put me there because I was his widow. He put me there because I had earned that seat long before any of them knew how to spell his name.